The Y method is a very useful tool and exercise that can be very helpful both in constructing boxes that are freely rotated in space, as well as to help us better understand the way in which vanishing points work and how they influence the forms we construct. It is a tool we'll be using a fair bit throughout this course. Earlier on at points like Lesson 1's Organic Perspective exercise, as well as the 250 box challenge that follows it, we'll be telling you to use this method specifically. In the future, however, you will likely find yourself coming back to it throughout this course and beyond. While a lot of students will describe it as being a technique that specifically works with three-point perspective, it makes more sense to describe it as a technique that is particularly useful when rotating boxes freely in 3D space, as opposed to the cases where the boxes align to the viewer's angle of sight in the ways that result in 1- and 2-point perspective. If you're unsure of what I mean by this, it's covered in the boxes lecture sections for Lesson 1. That doesn't mean you can't use it for the situations that call for 1- and 2-point perspective with some added considerations. But for our purposes here, we're going to focus on boxes with 3 concrete vanishing points, none of which will be at infinity. The Y in the Y method refers to the 3 edges that radiate out from the corner closest to the viewer. Each edge belongs to a different set of edges that are parallel to one another in 3D space. So in essence, what we're given here are 3 lines pointing to their own vanishing point. To avoid much in the way of distortion, it's best to try and keep the angles between the arms higher than 90 degrees. On top of this, you'll notice that while we don't know how long, wide, or deep our box is going to be yet, the edges also start enclosing the eventual planes that will make up our box. While we know that each of the Y's arms orient towards a vanishing point, what we don't know yet is where along that path the VP will actually sit. Some students will make the mistake of looking at this process as one of discovering a box whose vanishing points are already specifically defined, meaning that there's a clear right and wrong, but that is not the case. Rather, it's important that you look at the Y method as one of constructing a box that simply does not yet exist. The box does not have any specific proportions, nor does the box have a specific rate of foreshortening. These are things that we will decide as we work through drawing the remaining edges, but it is not something you can get wrong. The only thing you can get wrong here is whether or not our edges converge consistently towards their shared vanishing points, and those vanishing points will only be defined once we add a second edge to each set. As we draw the second edge, we have to consider whether we want it to converge with the first more rapidly or more gradually, which speaks to a concept known as foreshortening. Foreshortening is the term used to describe the visual cues that tell us just how much of the form's physical length exists in the unseen dimension of depth, which, as you know, a flat piece of paper cannot convey directly, and how much is actually measurable there on the page. When 2 edges converge together rapidly, meaning the distance between them is getting smaller very quickly, this generally means that the object is very large, like looking at the top of a skyscraper. Alternatively, it can mean the object is very close to the viewer's eye, although this is something you'll run into less often. Conversely, when our edges converge very gradually, it tells us the opposite, that the object is either quite small, and so the effects of perspective don't impact the farther end much more than the closer end, or that the object we're talking about is far away. As such, anything at a considerable distance is going to flatten out. Foreshortening also has a direct relationship with how far away our vanishing points are positioned on the page from the object we're drawing. The closer the vanishing point, the more rapid the convergence. The farther the vanishing point, the more gradual the convergence. So while you're drawing a box using the Y method, purposely pushing the vanishing point farther away or bringing it very close will allow you to control the rate of foreshortening more intentionally. Another point to consider, and this is something we'd have thought about when drawing the Y's initial arms as well, is how we want our box to be rotated, as rotation will result in a given edge's length existing more or less in the unseen dimension of depth as it turns. At the end of the day, if you don't specifically need to draw a box with a particular orientation, particular proportions, or a particular rate of foreshortening, You don't need to worry about these things beyond drawing the second edge of each set so it converges towards the first as it moves farther away from the viewer in space. With 2 edges defined for each set, here's where right and wrong starts coming into play. And again, it's only about convergence. As we draw each subsequent edge, keep doing your best to get them to converge consistently with the others in its set. You will make mistakes, and once we get into the 250 box challenge, we'll talk about how we can analyze our results to identify where those mistakes were and adjust our approach to improve. That's where this tool becomes a very effective exercise, helping us to better gauge our convergences so that when we need to add more edges to a construction, we can do so by referencing the other edges of that set already present on the page rather than always referring back to the vanishing point. While mistakes are inevitable, especially as we have to factor in the convergences while also ensuring that our different edges meet at their shared corners, there's already a tool in our disposal that can help us out. The ghosting method, which we should be using for each and every free-handed mark we draw throughout this course, starts with a planning phase where we plot out the start and end points of the lines we wish to execute. Normally we place those points, then ghost through the motion, and finally execute with a confident stroke. But those points can be useful in other ways because of how they have such a tiny, potentially negligible footprint on the page. So, as you see me doing here, we can put down a tentative point for where an edge is going to end, then consider an edge from a different set that shares that corner and plot out an endpoint for it as well. This gives us 2 distinct points from which we would need to form a single corner. Depending on the situation, we might lean towards one rather than the other, or we may plot a third point creating an average of the 2. And finally, we draw both our edges connecting to whichever point we decided on as our corner. This won't make your boxes perfect, but it will shrink the margin of error. That kind of intentional planning and consideration of the problem in front of you is what will make your practice more effective. And in combination with mileage and iteration, your margins of error will eventually become imperceptible. And that about covers it. To summarize, the Y method focuses on defining one edge from all 3 sets that make up our eventual box, and having them all radiate from a corner that is closest to the viewer. We add additional edges as we go, focusing on trying to get them to converge with one another consistently, and it's how rapidly or gradually the sets of edges converges that tells us how much of their lengths exist in the unseen dimension of depth versus what can be measured directly. And while mistakes are an inevitable part of the learning process, by leveraging tools like the ghosting method's planning phases and taking our time with each and every step, we will get the most out of the exercise and improve more efficiently over time. If there's one last thing to mention here, it's that there is no such thing as being too slow with this. I get that question a lot. Students express concern that they're simply going too slowly. There is no such thing. We are learning the underpinnings of all that will help us depict 3-dimensional worlds on a flat page. And so it's important that we give ourselves the time to do so patiently, carefully, and without unreasonable expectations of speed and pacing.